When I've spoken about Moloch or Molek in the past, I've often referred to him as a deity, the likes of whom was worshipped by the neighbouring tribes of ancient Israel and by dissenters of the Israelite community themselves. The way Moloch is referred to in certain biblical passages makes it seem like there could be no other alternative. Leviticus 20 verse 2 warns the Israelites not to sacrifice any of their children to Moloch, whilst Leviticus 20 verse 5 warns of whoring oneself before Moloch, both implying that Moloch had to have been some kind of figure. The Book of Kings outrightly describes him as a god of the Ammonites, further serving to reinforce the belief amongst readers that Moloch, or Molek, was indeed a false deity. Looking only at scripture then, it should come as no surprise that Moloch has since been imagined as a vile, detestable pagan god, who delighted in nothing more than the sacrifice of children, which seemed to be the exclusive way of worshipping him. We need only look to John Milton's Paradise Lost to see how Moloch is described as a horrid king, besmeared with blood of human sacrifice, and covered with parents' tears, whose screaming babes are drowned out by the noise of drums and timbrels as they are cast into the fires. English poet Alfred Tennyson refers to Moloch with babies being placed into the deity's red-hot palms, providing us with the imagery that children are given to this more supernatural entity, whilst poet Allen Ginsberg mentions Moloch in his poem Howl Part 2 a total of 39 times to express filth, ugliness, and nightmares. Moloch the cannibal, Moloch the loveless, Moloch the cocksucker even. Ginsberg isn't shy in detailing his feelings about this old entity. It's from such accounts that the modern mind has come to shape Moloch as this towering, horrible monster that feeds on the blood of children. Yet it's interesting how, in spite of these rather colourful descriptions from the likes of Milton, Tennyson and Ginsberg, Moloch in the Bible is barely even described. As aforementioned, most of the stories about Moloch are warnings from God to his chosen people. Don't sacrifice your children to Moloch because, as if it needed to be said, this is probably the most heinous thing you could do. Evidently, it was happening, otherwise the biblical God would not have had the need to ward against it so adamantly. But it also leads us to believe that there must have been something promised to the Israelites by this Moloch, or at least by the ritual itself, that would have them partaking in this diabolical practice. I mean, no one would just sacrifice their child for the sake of it, right? This is another reason why the traditional view was that Moloch had to have been a deity, because there was obviously some sort of higher power making these promises to the Israelites that if they gave up their children, they would receive some form of lucrative compensation. Again, the Bible says nothing of this. All we know about Moloch, deity or otherwise, is that the sons and daughters are sacrificed in practice, with parents either passing over or giving the child to Moloch. 2 Kings 23:10 specifies that children were passed into the fire, where we also learn of a location where these practices took place, an area of defilement known as Tophet, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Consulting Heath D. Dewrell's work, Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel, he tells us that the word Moloch was rendered from the original Hebrew term Molek, a 3-letter word which was traditionally understood to be the proper name of the pagan god, or even a demon, and that if one was to take the content of the Hebrew Bible, you could very easily come to the conclusion that the Molech rite involved sacrificing one's own child via burning in the cultic location of Tophet, just south of Jerusalem. However, even though at face value it might seem like Molech had to be a god, you couldn't necessarily say that this was absolutely certain. Dewrell notes that the Hebrew word for Molech is difficult to completely underpin, but that the original way to look at this was to read it as to the Moloch, thus framing Molech as a definite being and a recipient of those being sacrificed. Now you might point to the biblical verse of 1 Kings 11:5-7, where Moloch is specified in the New International Translation as being a god of the Ammonites, and you might come to the conclusion that this was proof enough that Moloch had to have been a god, and was the same Moloch referred to in Leviticus and the later accounts of Jeremiah. However, others propose that this might have been a scribal error, and that Molek here in this instance was actually meant to be Milcom, another deity of the Ammonites believed to either be a national god or one of equal importance. Dewrell also notes that depending on one's translation, Molek may or may not appear at all. Various Old Greek translators replaced Molek in the likes of Leviticus 18 verses 21 and Leviticus 20 verses 2 through 4 with the word ruler, relegating the Molek found in other versions as merely a nondescript vague entity that may not have even been a celestial authority. Other translators refer to this Molek as merely a king, providing us with the notion that people were sacrificing babies in honor of not a god, but a man, albeit one of obvious political importance. These traditional ways of looking at Moloch have since become defunct in some modern scholarly circles. Many would now argue that Moloch, or Molek, was never actually a deity worshipped by the surrounding people of Israel, the Ammonites, or even the Israelites themselves. Whilst much discourse regarding this still exists even today, one of the newer ideas is that Moloch, Molek, or Molech was in actuality merely the name of the ritual in which people would sacrifice their children, and therefore this was not a sacrifice to Moloch, but a Moloch sacrifice, with the term referring not to the recipient, but the victim of the sacrifice. This idea was first drummed up in the 20th century by German theologian Otto Eisfeld, where, based on archaeological evidence from the Punic colonies of the central Mediterranean, Molek takes on not the role of a deity, that's better left to the likes of Cronus and Baal-Hamon, but instead something else. Historians of the ancient world have always believed that the Punic colonists were avid fans of human sacrifice, and that the likes of the Phoenicians would give up their children in order to appease their god and extract a good fortune, especially in times of war or famine. Be sure to check out my video on that subject. You only need to consult the rather vivid account of 1st century BC historian Diodorus Siculus to see that child sacrifice wasn't just known about, it was perhaps even normalized, to the point that parents of the noblest families in Carthage would even attempt to introduce loopholes in order to sacrifice not their own children, but the children of strangers. They also alleged that Cronus had turned against them, inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god the noblest of their sons, but more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children, they had sent these to the sacrifice, and when an investigation was made, some of those who had been sacrificed were discovered to have been supposititious. Naturally, this would have fundamentally trivialized the act of sacrificing, and would in some sense be like sacrificing the bones of an animal, but keeping the meat for oneself. This surely would have angered Cronus, whose due was withheld from him, and so when the Carthaginians found themselves surrounded by enemies, they superstitiously believed that this was their punishment. This would, according to Siculus, cause them to compensate for their trickery by sacrificing even more babies and then later, even themselves. When they had given thought to these things and saw their enemy encamped before their walls, they were filled with superstitious dread, for they believed that they had neglected the honours of the gods that had been established by their fathers. In their zeal to make amends for their omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under suspicion sacrificed themselves voluntarily, in number not less than 300. There was in their city a bronze image of Cronus, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Whether or not these sorts of sacrifices took place in secret, or were actually public spectacles, is not known for certain. In fact, whether the rituals were practiced by poor folk and noble folk alike also differs from account to account, with the likes of Christian historian Eusebius that noting in his preparation of the gospel that when there was a time of great danger, rather than risking the destruction of everything, the rulers of the city would sacrifice their children as a ransom to the avenging gods, with these typically taking place in secret settings. There was a custom among the ancients in great and dangerous circumstances, rather than the destruction of everything, for the rulers of a city or a people to hand over the most beloved of their children for slaughter, as a ransom to the avenging gods, and those handed over were slaughtered secretly. While Siculus and Eusebius differ in their opinion on the sacrifices taking place in public or in secret, as well as there being a discrepancy over who exactly was doing the sacrificing, one common element is that these sacrifices were necessary during times of great distress, and that it was the deity Baal-Hamon of Carthage, replaced by Cronus for the Greek and Roman audiences of Siculus and Eusebius, that served as the recipient of these offerings. But where is Moloch, I hear you ask? Surely it was Moloch, who literally lived for child sacrifice, who would be the face of such a barbaric practice. According to these accounts, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century, when works such as Salammbô, by French novelist Gustave Flaubert, was Moloch even placed at Carthage, which only served to further entrench the public idea that Moloch was the deity whom children were sacrificed to. In Flaubert's depiction, Moloch is described as an iron statue which had several compartments on its body where children could be deposited into its fiery stomach. He also makes note of the statue's arms, which were operated by a series of mechanisms and chains, giving artificial life to the deity in what can only be imagined as some kind of macabre animation. We also understand from his work that there were priests of Moloch, known as the Pontiffs of Moloch, officiating over the ceremony. Moloch's brazen arms moved more rapidly. They no longer paused. Each time a child was placed upon them, the priests of Moloch extended their hands over the victim to charge upon it the sins of the people, vociferating, "These are not men, but oxen." And the multitude around repeated, "Oxen, oxen." The devotees screamed out, "Lord, eat." And the priests of Proserpine, confirming in terror to Carthage's need, mumbled their Eleusinian formula, "Pour forth fame, conceive." No sooner were the victims placed on the verge of the aperture than they vanished, like a drop of water on a red-hot plate, and whiffs of white smoke curled up through the scarlet glow. Flaubert would go on to add that Moloch's appetite was never appeased. He always wanted more. Children were piled up into his hands, and whilst there was an effort by the officials to count these infants, it soon became impossible with the sheer magnitude of babies that were being offered to him. All this lasted a long time, until nightfall. Then the interior divisions gave a most sombre glare. For the first time, the burning flesh was visible. Some people even fancied that they recognized hair, limbs, and entire bodies. Now, for a 19th century writer, you might say he possessed quite the imagination to present Moloch in this fashion. I mean, much of this is a very original take, and considering Siculus and Eusebius speak exclusively of Cronus, or Baal-Hamon, you can see that this was likely Flaubert's attempt to conflate and almost replace the deity that the historian saw at Carthage with a deity more recognized by a later biblical audience, one whom they would find synonymous with child sacrifice anyway, and so would easily accept. In essence, Flaubert made it up. Moloch, at least the version described in the Bible, was never there at Carthage. In 1921, excavations at Carthage saw the unearthing of several remains belonging to children in what was then believed to be evidence of ritualistic sacrifice. After all, Siculus and Eusebius had said that children were sacrificed here, and these findings all but proved it. In addition to these bodies though, was some even more damning evidence. the unearthing of various stelae in the ancient town of Nagaus, Algeria, that were inscribed with Latin. In one particular stele, known simply as Stele 3, it is written, "that it may be made good and favourable to the Holy Lord Saturn, a great nocturnal offering, soul for soul, blood for blood, life for life, for the health of Concessor, because of a vision and a vow, Felix and Diodora, willing in soul, have given an offering, a molkomor, a sheep for a substitute." The strangest word in this passage is molokomor, something which Dewrell explains has been attributed to two other Punic inscriptions, of which he presents for us. The first reads, "To the lady, to Tanit, face of Baal, and to the Lord Baal-Hamon, which Arasat, daughter of Bod-Astart, vowed a Molechemeh." The second reads, "Bod-Astart, son of Milkyatan, Molechemeh, for he heard his voice, he blessed him." Here Dewrell speaks of a connection that was put forth by French Orientalist Jean-Baptiste Chabot in the 20th century, that the Molokomor found on the Latin Stele 3 at Algeria, and the Molechemeh found in the Punic inscriptions, could be taken to mean the same thing: promise of the lamb, or the offering of a lamb, in fulfillment of a vow. French historian Jérôme Cocopino also built off of this idea and suggested that the molkomor, or the molechemeh, these offerings of the lamb, were means of supposition by parents who, wishing to receive the benefits of child sacrifice from Cronus, Saturn, or Baal-Hamon, were also unwilling to sacrifice their own child, resulting in them sacrificing a lamb in the child's place. If the deity in question would, for whatever reason, accept these terms, then the lamb would take the child's place, and thus the ritual of molkomor, or the molechemeh, was conducted. Cocopino adds that by the time of this ritual being conducted, the popularity of child sacrifice had obviously waned, perhaps under the pressure of Roman influence. In its place, a more human form of sacrifice was introduced, where animals, in this case sheep, would fit the bill on behalf of the child. Theologian Otto Eisfeld would point out yet another term found on several Punic inscriptions, Molechadum. Again, we have Dewrell to thank, who supplies us with two of these examples. In the first it is written, "To the Lord, to Baal-Hamon, a Molechadum, the vow which Baal-Pado, son of Magon, vowed. He heard his voice, he blessed him." In the second example, it is written, "To the Lord, to Baal-Hamon, and to the lady to Tanit, the face of Baal, an oath which is Hamokhat, son of Boastart, son of Nabal, vowed, a Molechadum, for he heard his voice, he blessed him." Eisfeld was one of the first to suggest a connection between the term Molechemeh and the term Molochadam, suggesting that if Molechemeh was the sacrifice of sheep in the place of a child, then Molochadam had to simply be the sacrifice of a child. From there, it wasn't that much of a leap for Eisfeld to come to the conclusion that if these Molech sacrifices were the names of rituals where children or sheep were sacrificed, then the Moloch sacrifices in the Hebrew Bible had to have been the same thing. Children then were not being sacrificed in the Bible to an ominous Ammonite deity that was luring the Israelites away from God in the same vein as Baal, but this was merely the process by which children were sacrificed. Eisfeld's translation of another Neo-Punic inscription from Constantine is also evidence of this being a possibility, whereby, I'm not going to read this, but Dewrell supplies us with the English translation, which reads, "To the Holy Lord Baal, in a fortunate day, for a Molech." Through this, we can see that the sacrifice in question here is obviously in tribute to Baal. Therefore, why would it also pertain here to another god in Moloch? Through this use of Lemelech, the L interpreted as for, as in for Molech, was enough for Eisfeld to conclude that when the Hebrew Bible mentions a sacrifice offered to Molek, it should be read simply as a Molek offering, not a sacrifice to Moloch as a deity. In a 1975 dissertation, Child Sacrifice in Canaanite and Israelite Religion, Professor Paul G. Mosca presents an exhaustive list of references from the 5th century BC regarding the child sacrifices that took place within the Punic colonies, all of which were in tribute to Cronus and Saturn, or Baal-Hamon. These offerings usually consisted of a child of noble birth being offered, either as part of an annual rite, as courtesy to the deity, or as an appeal to the deity to offer aid in times of great strife. Of these accounts, Mosca presents the aforementioned Moloch and the Moloch as posited by Eisfeld, but he also presents a third term, Moloch Baal. Mosca was in agreement with Eisfeld that Moloch was the sacrifice of a lamb, but whilst he also agreed that Moloch was the sacrifice of a child, he believed that it specifically indicated the sacrifice of a child who was not a part of the aristocracy, and who was not associated, whether legally or by blood, to the nobility or royalty. Mosca referred to it as simply the Molech sacrifice of a commoner. However, this Moloch Baal term is a new one, and it kinda gave me the impression at first glance that this was the sacrifice of a god, a Baal, irrespective of how this could even be achieved. Luckily, Mosca has a more plausible suggestion, and that is if Moloch was the sacrifice of a common child, Moloch Baal was then the sacrifice of a noble child, perhaps the offspring from a wealthy family, or one of political authority. Whilst many modern scholars now take the side of Eisfeld and view Moloch not as a deity, but as a ritual associated with child sacrifice, the exact origin of the rite, as well as whether the Israelites took part in it, still remains up for some debate. Perhaps even more interesting is that the very purpose of the ritual is still debated by scholars today, with some arguing that it was more of a personal sacrifice made for one to achieve their own ends, whilst others suggest it was a statewide offering that benefited all of the people at once. Another somewhat scathing, albeit intriguing idea I've come across is that the Molech sacrifices weren't actually foreign rituals that the biblical writers aimed to warn against, but were actually far closer to home than they'd like to admit. In her work, King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, Francesca Stavrokopoulou argues that the Molech sacrifices were not introduced to the Israelites by the likes of the Ammonites, but that this was their own ritual native to Israel itself, a means by which one might encourage fertility by offering their firstborn to Yahweh as a sacrifice. She then argues that the writers of the Bible, realizing that this Molech would be viewed as heinous and wicked as a result of the ever-changing societal attitudes, decided that it was best not to incriminate themselves as the creators of this atrocious practice, but frame the neighbouring pagan cults as the introducers of the ritual, and Israel as only the inheritors. Put simply, the argument over whether Moloch was a deity demanding child sacrifice, or whether it was simply the name of the ritual where children were sacrificed, is still contested amongst scholars and readers alike. Throw in the fact that no one can be certain as to when the Moloch first began, why exactly it was practiced, or who the main proponents of the tradition were, there's still certainly a lot of grey area surrounding the subject that we probably will never really get to the bottom of. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.